everybody, and welcome to our Let's Talk Organics webinar. And tonight we're going to look at the insight of growing protein crops. And joining us this evening is Pete Iannetta from the James Hutton Institute in Scotland, and my colleague Martin Bourke, Teagasc Organic Tillage Specialist. And between the two of them, we're going to have a presentation from both, and we're going to hear work they've done in their own research trials and their experiences of growing intercrops in Ireland and Scotland. So we're going to start at home with Martin. Good evening, Martin. How are you?
Hi, Elaine. I'm well, very well, yeah.
And I suppose it's a
Uh,
topic that, since you took up the role as an organic tillage specialist, that this is a topic that is, being looked at and being practiced very much in the organic sector.
yeah, well, look, it's there's I suppose there's a few crops being grown, oats being the big one, but it's the second biggest crop being grown is protein crops, and I'll show you the figures in a minute. So it's the backbone of a lot of the organic tillage rotations. So I'm hoping to share with you some of the lessons and findings I have found over the last 4 years in the job.
Okay,
What's been happening in
very
farms.
good, Martin. Just before you start, I'll hand you over to your presentation, just to remind people the chat function and put in your questions. And at the end, we've allowed for a bit of discussion with Martin and Pete. So with that, Martin, I'll hand over to yourself there.
Okay. So yeah, good evening, everyone. Hope you're all enjoying the slightly finer weather anyway. So yeah, so look, I just wanted to spend about 15 minutes going through a few slides about growing organic protein crops in Ireland and looking at particularly the different types of intercrops, which are quite popular on the tillage farms. Um, you'll see three logos on the screen there in front of me, starting with the Growing Organics logo, which is our Monitor Farm program. And I suppose we've been using that Monitor Farm program to carry out a lot of intercropping trials so far. And we're building on that then. The next logo there is the Fine project, which is our project looking at kind of networking of farmers. And as part of that, it's a European-wide project. We're going to actually be looking at trials on organic farms. So one of the trials for the coming years in that project will be looking at growing protein crops as well, intercropping peas and beans. And then the last logo there is the EIP we got funding for the OTV IWM project. And that project will actually allow us maybe to have a look at growing straight protein crops, which are more challenging to grow in organic production because they wouldn't be as competitive, particularly beans. So with mechanical weeding, camera guided type equipment, we may be able to grow straight protein crops in that program under that project. So it's exciting to see how we get on with that one. So we'll move on. So this is just a quick overview from the BIS figures from last year, from 2025, of the breakdown of the organic tillage area. And maybe I'll start with what's highlighted in the bottom in yellow. And that's obviously the oats. And there was 3,706 hectares of oats last year. 85–90% of that would have been spring oats. And then the rest was winter oats. But you can sort of see then the breakdown of the rest of the crops. Now, I didn't deliberately put in the cereal crops, the other cereals, the peas, the barley and the wheat, winter and spring. They would roughly come to 1,000 hectares all in. So you can actually see the second biggest crop on its own is this protein cereal mix, 50/50 crop. And that's primarily, obviously, your pea barley would be the common one, or your pea barley oat. Then you can see straight crops are, few and far between because of the challenges of the crops not being as competitive against weeds. So people tend to not grow them organically. It's more challenging. That said, I did see a few lovely crops of spring beans on those farm walks we had last year in May and June. A small amount of winter beans, very, very small there at 17 hectares and 9 hectares in conversion. Peas, again, quite small as well, straight peas. I suppose the issue too with peas is lodging when they're grown on their own. And then there's a few people just doing a bits and pieces of trial work with lupins. So that's the breakdown of the area. And moving on then to, I suppose, discussing the issues with the legume and cereal intercrops. They're not straightforward to grow or to get, I suppose, the same result. So what I mean here is quite often I would hear a farmer say that they grew the very same mixture bag of seed in one field, and in the very same day, maybe an hour later, goes into another field, sows the very same mixture, the same seed rate, the same seed drill, everything the same, and yet the two crops could look completely different at harvest time. And why is that, I suppose? So there's issues like we would like to see, a more standard type of legume cereal intercrop come harvest time. And I would say one of the issues is, first of all, species compatibility. So some species, whether that's pea or bean, they will mix better with certain cereals. So peas and barleys seem to mix very well together. Beans in the intercrop can struggle. I think they need to be raised in seeding rate. You need to give the bean a better chance. It's not as competitive in an intercrop. So there's things like compatibility, species, and some just get on better with others. Beans with oats, for example, is not as good either as beans maybe with barley. Barley is not very competitive, so sometimes you need to up the rate of barley in the mix. So there's certain compatibilities between species. Then you have variety compatibility, and this is important because you want to synchronize ripening in particular. Okay, and we don't want to be, for example, putting a cereal crop in with the normal type of bean varieties that could be ripening 3 weeks or a month later. So you have to try and make sure that your varieties come together. And if I was to pick, I should say actually, I suppose in terms of ripening, if you have there are early maturing bean varieties out there, and it makes a big difference when you're putting it with, say, for example, a pea. You can't be waiting on the bean for 3 weeks. You need an early bean variety. So the variety that you pick is very important. The compatibility in terms of its standability is very important. So you need a variety with good standing power. And there are huge differences, and I'll show you a photograph in a minute of the variety differences, particularly when it comes to lodging of peas. The biggest single issue I would say, though, and I'm going to hit on this again later, is pigeon grazing. There isn't maybe enough attention paid to pigeon grazing. Now, anyone that knows me well at some of these farm walks, you'll have heard me preaching at this stage about keeping an eye on the pigeons and don't let them in that kind of first 6 to 7 weeks after the crop is sown, once it emerges, because they absolutely love grazing the leaves of the peas early on. Another thing, and it was nobody's fault, but in 2023 and 2024, we had two incredibly late springs in Ireland, whereby there was very little sowing done until after the 20th or 25th of April, and it was well into May, really, in one of those years. And so the knock-on effect then is, it tends to emerge after first cut. So the peas in particular tend to emerge after first cut silage has been cut in a lot of areas, and birds kind of maybe go hungry for food again, and it's sitting there in an ideal stage for pigeons to graze. The other knock-on effect of the late sowing is a late harvesting date. And with that, then you're going to have a higher grain moisture, more weeds in the sample, and so on. And so, look, a lot of these factors will end up with significant variation in legume to cereal grain ratio at harvest. And thanks to my colleagues in the organic team, the advisors there, and my colleagues Joe and Elaine, you can see we gathered up a number of analysis of different intercrop mixtures that were at harvest, and collected them off farmers and tested them. So there's about 9 samples there. And you can just see with the blue arrows there, I have them highlighted, the lowest and the highest in terms of crude protein percentage. So that mix there, that was a barley pea oat mix, has to have been probably 99% of cereal crop. I would put money on it that crop got badly grazed with pigeons and there was no peas left in the mix. Versus a crop, that barley pea combi crop mix there is 18.9% protein. That was actually 72% pea and 28% barley by weight when you tested the sample. So it's to try, and you can see the average in the yellow box at the bottom there at 12.7. We would love to be able, I suppose the challenge is we want to try and produce a more consistent type of crop so that we're at least always maybe above 14%, try and get more pea into the mix. And I've kind of hit on this. So why the variation? It goes back to sowing date, the grazing of the pigeons. Okay. What I would say is it can go undetected at minor levels in other crops. So it's quite obvious in some crops because there's no peas left. but they're clever enough. They could be in there doing a little bit of early morning grazing or late evening grazing. They'll sneak back in. They could be doing a minor amount of damage without you noticing them there, enough to weaken the population of peas in the plant stand. So you just have to be vigilant, get bangers out, scarecrows out, and be there early. The variety of peas was certainly something I would have noticed in 2023, and had a good look at variety trials in 2024 and tried to basically find good varieties of peas. I had a good look at the Oak Park trials that my colleague Sheila Alves is involved in, and I plucked out one particular variety from that trial. I made note of it, a variety called Ingrid, and it certainly improved things in 2025. It was one of the main variety peas used in the intercrop mixes that were growing out on farms this year or last year, and it actually performed extremely well, especially from the point of view of lodging. It grew up a bit taller, but it doesn't lodge like the other peas. The knock-on effects, if you have a variety that lodges badly, if you can imagine, your pea lodges over and now the cereal component is in underneath, and the cereal in the mix will never see any sunshine when it's trying to fill the grain in that last vital grain ripening period, the last few weeks of its cycle. So you'll have, poorly filled grain. You're going to end up with higher moisture content in the sample, shedding, weed seeds, all the things, poor hectoliter weight. And look at the picture of that combine, quite difficult harvester operations, trying to pick up crops, scrape them up off the ground. Solutions then is quite obvious then. If I've mentioned late sowing dates, we should be trying to sow earlier if we can. Try to be more vigilant of peas at that early stage. Choose your better standing varieties of peas and choose cereal varieties that have a good straw strength score. There's the photograph I mentioned I'd show you. So this is the proof that there are differences in pea varieties in terms of lodging. So the photograph on the left is the Ingrid standing nice and proud, and the photograph on the right was a variety called Carioca, and it was, very badly lodged. Same treatments, same sowing dates, same everything. Okay, that photograph was taken in Oak Park. So in terms of proposed mixes, I would say if we look at the barley, pea is the most common one. And what I would say is if you're mixing the barley with the pea, from what I have found, the modern day spring barley is not a very good competitor in an organic situation, definitely. Pete might be able to comment in a non-organic situation as well, but I would say you need a higher percentage barley in the mix, and I would be suggesting you put 60% barley and 40% pea in the mix, because you have to have a 50-50 mix for the protein payment to get it at half the protein rate. But you have to make sure you have 50% peas, and there is a 10% tolerance. So I suppose you can't drop below 40% peas. Probably from an agronomy point of view, to increase the overall efficacy of the whole mix, I would even think 30-70 might be a better, or even lower. The peas can be extremely competitive. So you just have to be, so I wouldn't be going the other way around anyway, and going 60% peas and 40% barley, or the barley will just be taken over by the peas. Sow it at about 250 kilograms to the hectare. Now, if you're in a particularly, I would say, weedy field, if there's maybe weeds like red shank or whatever, you need to pack the ground with more seed. You need to make the crop even more competitive. I would up that seed rate to 300 kilograms to the hectare, which would be 120 kilos per acre. Ingrid, as I say, is the variety of pea that stood very well in Oak Park trials, performed very well last year, and will be available in mixes again this year. And then obviously choose cereal varieties. If you're making up your own mixes, make sure you pick a cereal variety with a good straw strength score. This is just a picture of a very nice crop of Ingrid. It was Ingrid pea, and it was mixed with the Gretchen spring barley and two varieties of spring barley. This was the Fruit Hill Farm mix last year on a farm in Kildare. But hopefully this might play as a video, but you can just see a lovely even proportion of barley and lots of peas in there that plays, yeah. So you can just see that's like a textbook type crop, really. That crop did about 2.65 or 2.7 tons to the acre, but a really, really nice crop. That was actually sown at 300 kilograms to the hectare. It's in a tillage rotation, but an absolutely lovely crop. Produced a kind of a 50% pea, 50% barley mix in the harvest sample, is what it turned out to be. So around a 15% protein mix. Other potential mixes you could have, you could go for your barley oat pea. And in that situation, you bring your barley back to maybe 45%, oats in at 15%, and then your peas at 40, and sow it again about the same seed rate, 250 kgs per hectare. And I suppose the advantage of that one would be as well, if you had a weedy field, the oats would have the allelopathic effect at smothering out some of the weeds. So that's maybe an advantage to that one. It might be just, if you're growing some for your own farm, or if you have sheep, maybe you might like oat in the mix, but it's just another option. And then you can look at the non-cereal intercrops. So this would be where you'd have a full protein intercrop. We've been looking at these. Um, as I say, my colleague Sheila Alves is leading the Valpropath project in Oak Park, and they're looking to maximize the value of peas. They're trying to encourage more peas to be sown, and they're intercropping them with beans because the beans act as a scaffold to support the peas from lodging. But they're really after the peas in that particular project. And they're going to maybe look at the potential of peas in human food, pastas and bread, all that kind of stuff. And I suppose the bean in that situation is just a fall guy. The bean is just acting as a scaffold because it's peas is what they're after. Um, what I have done, I suppose, or what I've been looking at with that trial, like that was brought to 3 organic farms and has been for the last 2 years and will again this year. So I suppose I've been observing what's happening in that trial from an agronomy point of view, but I'm also looking at it from the point of view of what we end up with in terms of a sample at harvest time. And one thing I have noticed is a very high amount of pea and only a tiny trickle of peas, and not very well filled peas, because they're lying in underneath the pea and they're not getting any sunshine or light to fill them properly. So I'm looking at it more from the animal feed market. Maybe there might be a way of tweaking it. As I say, the issues then, the peas are too, in my opinion, for a nice balanced organic animal protein for the feed market. The peas are too dominant in that mix. Um, the early maturing, you must have an early maturing variety. If you're going to grow peas and beans together, none of the conventional bean varieties, as I would call them, are early enough. Even the early ones that are on the PGRO list are not early enough. So we actually have been using a Finnish variety. One for a few years, Louis was the variety used, and now the variety is Vire, Vire. But the disadvantage of those very early varieties of beans is they are definitely not as good as a scaffolder. They're weak. The stems are a little bit skinnier, so you just have to be. You'll need more of them to support the weight of the peas leaning down on them. So what we would have noticed with as I say, with the 70-30 pea to bean ratio was that the peas were just leaning down, lodging, and now you were getting poor formation then of grain, uneven ripening, higher moisture, all these things, more weed seeds, hard to harvest, and as I say, loads of pea in the sample with very little bean and poorly filled bean. So with the O'Fine project in mind, we're going to look at projects there to maximize the pea and bean mix for animal feed. I've just put in green writing there my own kind of overall aim of what we're trying to achieve, or a mission, and I've written to produce a more balanced harvest sample of well-filled peas and beans with less lodging and better light capture during ripening. It sounds lovely, but that's the fancy aim is what I phrased it as. But so I effectively just want to have a nicer sample at harvest, and I'd like to see more beans in the sample, and I'd like to see a crop that's not lodging. So the first thing I will say is, and that is, the bean has to be an early maturing variety. The beans will have to be in my opinion, at a higher percentage of the seed ratio. So what we'll look at in these trials is we'll have a look at the 50-50 type mix, a 60-40, a 70-30, even up to 80-20. And we'll use the better standing variety of peas, which at the moment the one we're using is Ingrid. So that should be interesting to see what comes out of that, and we'll be doing that on a number of these farms in the O'Fine project. It's part of that project is to carry out these trials. And the last thing I would say then is, I suppose we have to be vigilant for the grazing of the pigeons in those trials. So from about emergence until about 6 weeks in will be vital. Until the peas kind of knit together, the tendrils form together, and there's nowhere for pigeons to land, then you're kind of safe. And I can't highlight that enough, so I'm going to say it again, because that can determine your success or your failure. The last other potential mix I just want to mention is the pea bean barley mix. And so we have here, I suppose, 2 legumes and a cereal. And we tried this out on a couple of farms last year. And what I can say is the the general concept or the general provisos to have a successful crop apply to this as well. So what I would say is this seed was sown by one grower in Wexford. The field nearest the house was perfect, yielded about 2.6 or 7 tons to the acre. The field down the road, in out of the way, the pigeons grazed, and he ended up with a field of barley and beans because the pigeons won't graze the beans, and with no peas. And it did about 1.5 tons to the acre. So you can, I can't stress the importance of keeping an eye on these pigeons. But where it was done well, beside this farmer's house, the three species grew really well together. There was no lodging issues. The beans, the only thing I'd say is even with that really early variety of bean, it came in about 4 to 5 days, I would say, in terms of ripening after the pea and barley. So we were lucky. We had a good harvest window last year to wait. The sample then, when it was checked on from a sample taken and sieved out the fractions, there was 65% barley, 21% pea and 14% bean, moisture content 17, and so the protein was almost 15%. But it was a really, really nice crop, and everything seemed to complement. I keep talking about species compatibility and all, and in this particular situations, you could see everything working in harmony together. It was just a perfect example. There's a picture from that field, so you can see in my hand there a nicely filled pea. The nicely filled bean, they look small, but that's actually a characteristic of the variety. The 1,000 grain weight is the same. It's effectively the same size as a pea and a nice plump grain. On the right-hand side was the crop just before harvest, and you can see the black pods of the pea not lodged over, standing upright, they've got lots of light. You can see the pods of the peas beside the beans there, and you can see lots of heads of barley. It was just a lovely, even crop, and it's an example of what can be achieved. And then look, my last slide, I'm just going to put in a plug for this project. I'm involved in this EIP, OTV IWM, which stands for Organic Tillage and Vegetables Integrated Weed Management. And I'm asking the question there, can we successfully grow straight protein crops organically? And I suppose it's a challenge because particularly, as I say, crops like, for example, beans or crops like lupins, they're not naturally competitive. They can be quite open, especially as the growing season goes on, and weeds will very easily make their way back up through those types of crops. So we're going to look at in this project blind weeding possibly. So that'll be basically doing a tine harrow operation on the ground before the crop emerges. So to try and take out weeds at that kind of the white thread stage, we would say, before they make their way through the surface. And then we also will have camera guided equipment to interrow the rows of the straight protein crops. We'll particularly look at, one of the farmers is going to look at lupins, another is going to look at straight beans. So we'll see how we get on in that project. I think that's it. Yeah, Elaine, so I'll stop sharing. Thanks very much. Oh.
Okay, Martin, thank you very much. I'm never going to look at a pigeon in the same way after that, Martin. So very, very good. And look at any questions that you have for Martin. We'll take them after Pete. So put in your questions and answers there. Thank you very much, Martin. And Pete, welcome.
Hi.
How are you?
Very well, thanks. Yourself?
Not too bad at all. First of all, I have to thank you for joining us this evening. So thank you very much for that, just in case I forget later on. Maybe, Pete, by way of introduction, before you start your presentation, maybe give us a background of what your work involves on a day-to-day basis.
So today I'll certainly be talking about legumes. I've been working on legumes for a long time. My PhD was in legumes about 30 years ago. I was brainwashed at an early age. My professor, a lady called Janet Sprent, used to write into the press even at that time saying, why aren't we, eating and growing our own peas and beans? But I started off working on regulation of nitrogen fixation, but I've done an awful lot since then. I've worked on almost every science discipline, and I now mainly lead EU projects or projects led by industry, so in tandem with industry, so quite applied with my research, but covering a broad range of topics from soil function all the way through to policy.
So from the ground up, from the soil up, the whole way. Okay, well look I'll let you share your screen and let you take off then. So
okay.
Get you up and running.
So that's a great lead-in talk by Martin there. I'm going to try and whiz through a load of slides in about 15 minutes to give you a taste of what we do at the James Hutton Institute. Just move that out of the way. And so as well as working at the James Hutton Institute, I also have another position at the University Católica in Porto, where I work with the nutrition group there. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what we do in the group. So the James Hutton Institute. So we've been around about 100 years. We've had various inventions over the years, but we emerged in 2011 as a system-based research institute. And we've just had about £100 million of development there. So we're about 600 strong, mainly based at 2 sites in Aberdeen and Dundee. And we cover almost all aspects of the system, including farmer choice, psychology aspects, and law. Of course, I'm going to talk to you about legumes. You know what they are. I don't need to explain them to you, but it certainly does annoy me when they're referred to simply as nitrogen-free fertilizer or meat substitutes. We can maybe pick up on that in a discussion later. They're a lot more than those things. They're, as well as providing protein and obviously starch. They've got what's called a symbiotic microbiome in their roots, and they're phytochemically very diverse. So even beyond what they give to animals and humans as food, they give a very complex array of chemicals back to the soil. I work within an agroecology group, and we emerge really to test systems. So we respect all forms of farming, whether it's organic, and people call it regenerative, and it seems 101 different forms of farming. But we look to whole system potential. We try to assess whole systems in an open and fair way, and tend not to get bogged down in the names of what's done. More concerned about what is done and the impacts of what is done. But we're trying to, for us as a group, trying to balance economic and ecological and social needs. But with that in mind, one of the platforms that we have that's been very good for us is the Centre for Sustainable Cropping. Been around since 2009. We have 300 indicators that we look at that system. The rotation is there. We have field beans in there. We've also got clover understories to the barley as well. It's managed by my colleague Kathy. We call it's an integrated platform, aspiring to organic probably. I call it innovation stacking. The long-term monitoring is important because a lot of scientific experiments just can't identify ecological processes. They can't really elaborate on them in a typical short-term science study. But we're focusing on, of course, soil quality, the nutrition, biodiversity protection, water qualities, but also profitability. And that's been a source of a lot of data for us. This is how it looks on the ground. I stands for an integrated field half, C is the conventionally managed field half. So it's a true scientific experiment. And we find that we've got no yield loss there for most crops on our integrated field halves. And we see a lot of ecosystem service benefits. We're maintaining yield with 25% less synthetic fertilizer use. We're improving soil and water qualities. Our biodiversity is higher. As a 6-crop unit, it's significantly lower greenhouse gases on the integrated side as well, and each field half is equally profitable. So it's quite nice to have that there as a platform. I'm figuring that after this talk you'll get this presentation to look through in your own time, but if you're interested in the things that we do, the interventions themselves, there's a list of them there, but I won't go into them in too much detail at the moment. But also as part of this system, we have another project that's emerged called the Bifarag Toolbox, and these are farmer-friendly tools that you can use on the ground to look at how your system's responding. This is just an example of some of the indicators on the conventional and the regenerative field halves with different crops, the potato, winter wheat, winter barley, and so on and so forth. Green is something that's good. Yellow is not so good, and red is probably a little bit dangerous. And it helps us guide what we're doing at the CAC, and other farmers are now adopting that. And there's a publication there if you want to dig into it in more detail. But the platform for me has been very good. We've been looking at the data in all sorts of forms. But this is just a quick overview of one of the tools, another one of the tools that we use. Life cycle assessment. Here we're looking at spring barley environmental impacts after field beans. And to cut a long story short, the black bars show barley after field beans, and you can see the impact is lower for barley crops after field beans. That's a function largely of the benefits that the beans are providing to the soil. The curious thing for us about this is we get a 1 ton yield uplift after beans and barley. That certainly helps lowering the impact because the impacts here are calculated per ton of yield. But not in all years. You'll see in the last year there, the impacts with barley after beans was high. And that's mainly because the beans had a poor year. And it shows you the importance of having a good post crop to keep your environmental impacts low. And certainly the CSC, if we have a yield below 3 tons per hectare, then we're looking at a higher environmental impact on the barley that follows. And the beans at the CSC can be very good in some years, up to almost 10 tons per hectare in our best year. But life cycle assessment is something that we're using more and more of. It's not generally used for crop systems, and I like it because it tells me a lot more than a carbon footprint, a simple carbon footprint tool or even biodiversity tool. Another tool we're working on is Crop Goblin. This is more of a top-down approach than a bottom-up approach. Crop Goblin basically eats data. And what we're doing here is using data from England mainly. We've used and we've assessed crop rotations in different regions of England. So we've got the baseline rotations calculated, and then we're using AI and machine learning to suggest crop rotations that will allow us to increase pulses to 20%, because we're looking to cut greenhouse gases in the UK by 50% by upping field bean use to 20% of the rotation. And that can be done with enough demand from the feed industries. So this data will eventually be taken into Crop Goblin, and what it spits out, what Crop Goblin spits out at the end is information that's compatible with our national inventory database for greenhouse gas reporting. So we're hoping to evidence that it's a good investment in the UK to up field beans to 20%. We're not quite there with the data yet. We've certainly baselined the rotations. We've looked at all England's share of crops, the main crops. We've tried to engineer these overall average rotations to minimize impact on wheat, because that was very important to the English farmers. Also minimize impacts to oilseed rape and barley. And this is an overall average of what might be achieved. And actually, we could even be using some set aside and not even affecting some of the other crops at all. So that is another project we're working on. As I said, LCA is something that we started a long time ago. We used peas to make gin. And it's worked very well. We did it with a company called Arbiki. We developed a climate positive gin and a climate positive vodka. The distillery is on the farm. It's a short value chain, and it went from no peas in their rotation to 20, and they're getting now peas from other farms. So it shows you as well how the value chain, I think, can affect what's done, but also the life cycle analysis was used to drive the sales of the products. And increasingly, I'm seeing that's the case, where these impact assessments are being used to evidence certain environmental claims. There's a lot of greenwashing out there. So having independent scientists validate some of the claims is becoming far more popular. But the peas work well. The potail was used to feed cows, and we avoided import of soya, of course. And we could also use field beans there. We've done experiments generating alcohol with field beans, even lentils. I don't think that's so profitable, really. And the potail is protein rich, and it could be used for human food. So we're working on that as well. And that's a picture of the products. And increasingly, the Irish universities are quite heavily involved in what I'm doing, because they have quite good tools for life cycle analysis of crop systems. And if you're interested in the publications, they are there. We've got a lot of nice videos about peas and beans and what they can do. This in particular was about the gin. It's been picked up at quite a high level, but we've also made a lot of beer with peas as well. Again, evidencing how sustainable that they might be. But going on to intercropping, perhaps in a bit more detail, more and more I'm looking towards having the option of harvesting whole crop or grain, depending on the year. Beans can still be quite challenging to grow. This is just an example of best combinations of crops that we used in two different trials. So one was a winter fava bean wheat combination, the other one was a spring pea and wheat. I'm using wheat mainly because of organic farmers that I'm speaking to who are trying to feed their hens on the farm. But anyway, the whole crop worked well with the winter combination, and the grain worked best in the spring combination in terms of tons per hectare yield and protein yields. And this was all achieved in the complete absence of fertilizer. We did have a fertilizer treatment as part of this trial, and it wasn't necessary. And certainly in a hard summer, in a difficult summer, it seems that the winter beans aren't always the best at converting their biomass into grain. And other people have reported that from Teagasc in England. So that's not that's something to think about. The farm I work with is organic farm. It's Scotston Farm. It's just outside Dundee, where I'm based. It's a family run, 2 generations, 3 brothers. It's an upland farm. It's organic since 2015, and it's got obviously cattle ewes and 5,000 laying hens. The big driver for Scotston is protein self-sufficiency. It shows where they are. They operate a short value chain as well, and they do meat, eggs, and oats for human consumption. They use the land quite strategically. They beans are allelopathic as well. Oats, you probably already know, are allelopathic, and only surplus is being sold off farm. Nothing goes in bulk. They're currently about 18% self-sufficient, and they're looking to get up to the next 20 or at least 10. And what they're mainly focusing on is pea and wheat intercrops. Most of the intercropping I've done has been with pea and barley. We can dig into that in a bit more detail. But a big thing for Dermot, and here he is that seed sorter, which he just got. It is actually made in 1975, but it's functioning very well. He's just commissioned it this year, and he'll be putting his first crops through it. But that is mainly to separate barley and wheat. I think he's saved himself probably about 30 or 40,000 pounds getting second-hand equipment and doing a little bit of welding. What he's going to do as well with that is buy a dehuller next, so he can get rid of the fibrous hulls, and that will up his protein concentration. But as I said, he is going big, very big on peas and wheat and beans and oat to make up that. He's also doing cover cropping quite heavily and windrow composting that he inoculates with a series of biologicals, and that's helping his production as well. So I found that quite interesting. So with regards to pea and bean intercropping, this is Sam, one of our PhD students, and he has 3 trials going on last year. One we call the follow-on fertilizer offset trial, mainly with Synergy and Chameleon varieties, a stand density trial where he was looking at different density combinations and also different varieties. Now, the fertilizer trial will spill over into 2026, and we'll see how barley performs. But certainly he'll be looking at other ecosystem benefits, soil qualities, soil nutrient status, protein yield optimization, and he also is going to look at whole crop and grain options. And what he's found so far, initial synthesis, is that the pea and bean intercropping can increase yields, but the benefits are conditional, not universal. Beans dominate or should dominate the intercrop if you want higher bean densities, raises yield and protein yield. Higher pea densities reduces the protein yield. You've probably intimated this already, Martin, but peas seem to perform best at lower stand densities. In my intercropping work, it was with barley, I wouldn't go above 20% peas, otherwise the barley suffers. And we have some pea harvest losses as well because some of them are ripening too early ahead of the bean. That looks like it appears as a loss, but what we've seen is the pea is germinating and acting like another cover crop. And then that dies in the winter. So I'm curious to see how the barley does after this shattering and loss of peas. But nevertheless, Montara pea is a maple pea. It stands really well. I find the maple peas do stand better and have a higher protein content. In our case, it worked best with a K2 bean, and it showed strong and consistent intercrop performance. The soil outcomes were different. We actually found that the bean was quite good at removing a lot of nitrogen from the soil, actually, although it obviously gives a bit back. Immediately after harvest, the soil itself is quite N neutral. But what we're doing is we're monitoring the soil monthly now as we head towards the next crop. But certainly the pea and the intercrops were quite N positive immediately after harvest. There was also faster residue turnover in the intercrops, and that suggests more microbial activity in the soil and altered post-harvest mineralization. So that could have benefits for the following crop as well. Another thing that interests me, really, I'm just getting to the end of my talk now, is that beyond environmental impact assessment, I'd certainly like to be doing more natural capital, looking at natural capital accounting, particularly from field beans. If I look through the literature, it's quite clear that soil health can be improved after field beans, up 5 to 15% within 10 to 15 years. Microbial biomass is up, aggregate stability is up, water quality can be improved with lowered leaching, lowered runoff, especially if you combine them with catch crops. And air quality, greenhouse gas emissions down, biodiversity up, can double pollinator abundance and other insects. And we've seen this consistently wherever we've looked on average. Again, in England, or about 0.9 to 1 tonne a hectare, wheat yields can be up after beans, and soil N credits can be big. We generally find 10 kilograms of N per tonne of yield. But the benefits are agronomy dependent, and there's still, certainly in the UK, I think far too many farmers who are not cropping beans optimally. They're just treating them as a break crop rather than another equivalent cash crop. So anyway, we are working on other crops as well. We have some dwarf French beans that we've bred at the Institute in the 70s, generally forgotten about. We're going back to the field with them in the glasshouse or Taigan. We've been bulking them up. We're going out next year to see what we can do. That will be an intercrop with barley. We've got a very rapid cycling, but it's the same time frame as a pea, maybe slightly longer, but only slightly. And that's a dwarf faba bean that works well with barley as well as an intercrop. We've done black chickpea, it's worked very well. Grass pea, these are low dopa lines. Some grass peas have an earth toxin in them, so these come from Spain. We found one variety that does especially well. That's high essential amino acid. Again, that's going out as an intercrop with barley also. And we have a green lentil line that's done very well. It's that's actually not right. That was 5 tons. Oh, there's a misprint there. I've copied down another line that's wrong, but we're getting about 2.5 tons of lentil in the intercrop with barley. And we've had field trials, and we're going up to 1 hectare now of green lentils that we're growing, and looking at supplying that to the organic grower at Scotstoun Farm, Dermot, that I mentioned earlier on. So that's it really from me. This is just a taste of some of the projects that we've got going on at the Institute. If you want to find out more about them, all of them are centering on legumes and pulses. I've got an army of PhD students I'm very grateful for. You'll notice that I work very closely with PGRO. They're one of my greatest supporters. I'm very grateful for the help. But almost all of these students, bar 2, are working on field bean. So although it is a challenging crop, we certainly in the UK are looking towards it as a game changer. And that is it from me from now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Pete. You're very busy. A lot of projects going on.
I'm not going to disagree with that.
Absolutely. Well, while you catch your breath there, a lot of questions coming in. Maybe, Martin, just starting with you, seed availability for 2026. What's it
Yeah.
looking like?
I would say if you're looking for the pea barley mix, this which was available for sale last year, with the Ingrid in it. I know that Fruital Farm have the same mixtures again this year. I know that actually Elmer has already sold a lot of it, but he said there's still more coming in. He can get more in. So there is the barley pea mix is available there. So that's the Ingrid, and it was mixed with the variety of barley Gretchen and Etoile. So similar to last year, you also will have that mix that has the 15% oats in it as well. The three-way mix, the barley, oat and pea. Yeah. So 45% barley. So the mixtures I mentioned, 45% barley, 15% oats and 40% pea. So there's two mixtures available there, and they're pre-mixed. So that's what's available in Ireland. You do have your overseas mixes available as well.
Yeah.
I don't think there's Ingrid in those mixes, but I can't stress the importance of having a pea with a good standing power. I'd be looking for Ingrid in the intercrop mix. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pete, maybe over to you. In relation to the beans, in an organic situation, how do you find beans performing and yielding?
Certainly from the literature, from what I've read, and to an extent seen, beans perform better where soil nitrogen is lowest. So they tend to do well in an intercrop system, in an organic system. So they fix more from the air, it's more nitrogen from the air, and their protein concentration can be a little bit higher. You have to weigh that up against potentially reduced yields, but I don't think, I don't know what you find yourself. Do you find organic bean and pea yields are lower than conventional pea and bean yields?
Martin,
No.
your work what?
No, in fact, in those pea bean trials with the Valpropat project on the 3 organic farms that they were tested on, they were also tested on 3 conventional tillage farms as well. And on 2 of the 3 organic farms, they actually out yielded the conventional yield. So with all the bells and whistles, they still out yielded the crop that got all the bells and whistles.
Yeah,
So
so high soil nitrogen generally doesn't do beans good. I did an experiment a long time ago now, reported at Oxford University, but we found that as you increase nitrogen content, the yield, the roots got smaller, the plants got smaller, the yield went down. So nobody's really dug into it too deeply, but it's clear to me that these plants have not evolved for high nitrogen environments.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe that leads on to my next question. Maybe Pete first. The legume component, we always talk about it fixing nitrogen to the cereal crop. What other function does it do? We're very focused on that part.
Yeah, you see, I challenge that, Elaine. From the experiments that have been done, as much nitrogen moves from the non-legume to the legume as from the legume to the non-legume, but that's during growth. So most of the nitrogen is really exchanged post-harvest. So as soon as the legume reaches peak nitrogen fixation, about early pod fill, the plant starts shutting down. The nodule starts senescing. That's really when it starts to gift nitrogen to the system. So yeah, but you're right. There can be effects that appear to be nitrogen dependent, but I don't think they are. Obviously the legumes can attract rhizobia and they nodulate, but they actually attract a lot of other microbes as well. It just so happens that there's one class of microbes, the rhizobia, that causes nodulation. So I think it's something to do with the legume making a symbiotic microbiome. We believe that's what's going on, but there is also competition and facilitation effect. So that would be a facilitation effect. But the fact that the cereal is more competitive for nitrogen, it's removing nitrogen from the system and allowing the bean to perform better, almost in an organic system. So it's a complex interaction, but actually it's not driven by really nitrogen. It's driven by competition and these facilitation effects. So there's lots of exudates that they lose into the soil, It has quite a lot of effects beyond the microbiome. We know it's got soil physical effects as well. And we're noticing certainly that fields following faba bean production are more workable in the wet. And farmers are being able to crop their fields earlier in the spring if they had faba bean in the year before. And we're finding that with Sam, the PhD student I mentioned, we're finding that the water runoff capability is greater following a field bean crop.
Okay, and that comes on to my next question for both of you is, Martin, you were saying not to sow too early or too late. So when should you sow? When's the optimum time for sowing? I know we're very dependent on weather in Ireland, but
Depends on when they're taking up, especially after all this rain, but it can take up very, very quickly. If you get a week of soakage and another few weeks or days of drying wind, we could be having a different conversation. But the earliest, like last year, if we go by last year, there was farmers who sowed around the 19th or 20th of March, I remember. They started sowing some spring oats then, and there was certainly some of these intercrops were sown and they performed extremely well. But we have to remember they got very kind weather in April. They got a very warm spring. So in another season, you might have paid the price for sowing too early. So usually you want an organic crop not to meet a cold, hard week to slow growth down. You want the crop to motor from the word go. So I suppose if I was playing the percentages, I'd be trying to be patient. It's very hard to be patient. It's easy to say it. It's easy for me to say it, but it's very hard to stop someone getting up and getting on with the work. But try and wait till certainly the latter days of March and getting into April. You know, if I could pick a time period, I'd probably say, 5th of April to the 15th of April would be ideal. But that's fine for me to say. There's practical decisions get made at farm level, and you have to go sometimes and make a decision to sow. The forecast could be suddenly coming down the road and bad, but there is, as I say, last year those March sown crops performed extremely well, and the advantages were too we had an early harvest. But I think last year was a unique year weather-wise here, anyway.
Yeah. What about yourself, Pete? What would you add to that?
Yeah, we would go in maybe not quite as late as 15th of April, a little bit before then. And actually, some years I've seen us going in February. But that would be exceptional. Now we've just seen a big change in the weather with the wet. I don't know about you, but it's wet for longer. It's milder, but it's wet for longer. We've got some experiments going on with winter field bean, and it's another experiment. It's already in. They're up, but not far. And we're going to stitch in peas to a winter bean, so spring peas to a winter bean. But again, the day we'll go in will probably, ideally for me, I'd be looking probably about a month earlier, I would say. Yeah. In Scotland, on the east coast of Scotland. Yeah.
Now,
we're talking about standing though, Martin, and your crops or peas standing. We've had nice results with maple peas. I know not everybody likes them, but they're not really an issue for ruminants, and they tend to be higher protein. But I found Rose and Montera to be just great standing peas, and also the pigeons tend not to like them.
I might try them.
Especially if you put normal peas at the side of the field, the pigeons will go to. You almost use them like they're sacrificial, because once they taste those relative to the maple peas, they don't seem to like them so much. Another thing I've done, but it is an expensive option, but for some trials we've had to do it, is fleece them.
Wow.
Yeah, but that's a bit extreme.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just moving on then, undersowing. Maybe Martin first, any types of undersowing, for example, low-growing clover that might smother out weeds, the peas or the beans. Have you any experience of that?
I have no experience of undersowing peas and beans. Maybe Pete has, but there'd be some growers out there who are undersowing oats, and they're putting clover, they're undersowing clover, low small leaf clover, and they're getting a beneficial effect in terms of, I suppose, smothering out any weeds. But the big effect they're seeing is in the second year. So after they harvested oats, they go with a second crop of oats the following year, and it's always extremely clean of weeds, and also a very good crop because there's nitrogen coming from it. And that's something we're going to look at ourselves on some of the growing organic farms this spring. But in legumes, we haven't tried it, but I'm always game to try anything. So maybe I'll try and incorporate something on that into some of the legume intercrops this year.
It would be good to do there. Certainly work with wheat and understories has shown that, and this was done in the 70s by somebody called Clement, and I love his work. There was some low growing clovers. They were Aber types, and they just didn't knock back the wheat yield. And I think you know, a lot of clovers have been bred really for animal feed, of course, and whatnot. So I think there are some almost ignored varieties of clover, and people say, no, they're not vigorous enough for these other markets. But I think they'd be just right for an understory. And certainly Clement's best work, he herbicide retarded the clover. You don't want to be doing that, of course. But he did find one variety, I'm sure it was an Aber type, that was very low growing, quite a poor growth, but it did grow very well. We've also tried using a drone in faba bean, but we're doing that in our Centre for Sustainable Cropping. We're dropping seeds by drone later on in the faba bean ripening stage. So just as the leaves are senescing, the canopy is opening up, you're dropping these seeds by drone, and that's giving us a relay catch crop. Yeah, and that seems to be working quite well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Moving on now, people, a couple of questions here on nutrients. So, Martin, in terms of organically growing, any advice on how to best to fertilize these crops?
Yeah. Well, I suppose organically, we don't have as much choice as a conventional grower, because as Pete has been mentioned, they don't need that nitrogen supply. But unfortunately, some of the organic manures that we might be using, whether it's even organic manures that are lower in nitrogen. So I suppose the first thing I would say is if you're trying to address the phosphorus and potassium offtakes that are coming off in the crop yield, you try to match those. But the organic manures you use will have some nitrogen. So I suppose you'd pick the ones that have the lowest amount of nitrogen, which would be maybe some slightly more, maybe watery slurry or farmyard manure. But you don't want, for example, poultry manure, free range poultry manure that's loaded in nitrogen going onto a leguminous crop. But in saying that, you do want to watch your P and K offtakes if you were, you know, so it could be a case that, look, the following year you make up for what you didn't put on in the P and K in the year that you had the legume crop. So the following year you make notes, like a balance sheet, and just put a little bit of extra P and K on the cereal crop if there's a cereal crop the following year, so that over time you're not depleting the nutrient. I'm not sure, does Pete want to add to that?
Yeah, well, we've just finished a PhD studentship with PGRO again, looking at NPKS, but particularly the PKNS. I've just been underwhelmed. Well, the student itself were really hard, but the negative results were clear that the beans didn't need, certainly in a conventional system, we didn't study them in organic systems, but in a conventional system, they were grabbing all they needed from the soil, and all our treatments had no effect. However, I still think there's a window here for foliar applications later in the growth cycle, because I've done my own experiments using foliar applications before early flowering, and that seems to have helped quite significantly. So although, you know, applying it to the soil when, you know, and having, even if you do splits, there's been no effect, I still think, yeah, I'd like to do some stuff later in the life cycle with foliar applications to see what that does. But certainly my work looking at impacts on the soil, surprisingly little effect.
Is that mainly in beans, those foliar applications, Pete, or peas? Is it beans or peas?
They were all field beans, those trials.
Right, interesting.
Yeah.
I have somebody here that's growing wheat, bean and pea together for 2 years. They're based in the West where there's a lot of wind, and just in relation to nutrients, any nutrients to help the crops to help them keep standing. So what can you, and maybe what to avoid?
Well, look, the nutrient, I've done a bit of work in my time on potassium in cereal crops, and like obviously potassium would have a key role to play in straw stem strength and functioning, but it can only do so much. I would say I would go back to what that mix involved first of all. If there's lodging, like what I suppose would go back to, I'd love to know what the composition, how much peas were in that mix. Because ask yourself, of those three components you mentioned, it was wheat, beans and peas. So the first thing that's going to lodge or be under pressure is the peas.
Okay.
I wouldn't say the beans really, and the wheat shouldn't be too much. So then I'm wondering if you were to lower the percentage of the pea to bean, and the ratio would have more of effect than any nutrient will. I'm just, that's my own feeling on it. I don't know, unless Pete, you want to add to that?
No, I think you're right. The peas are far more competitive, you know, through your spot one. I'd say especially if I'm going for yield, I try to make the bean high. I don't know what work's been done on stand density in Ireland, but certainly We've done some experiments at the Institute, and I've gone up to 60 plants per square meter, and the yield was still increasing for the beans.
Yeah.
So I think we could, in Ireland and Scotland, we can go far more densely than we think. And that
Yeah, person just come in and say that they had 20% peas and they had 30% bean in the mix. That's what
Right,
they had.
interesting. Yeah, well, that
Yeah.
wasn't too much pea. Yeah. And then I wonder, was the variety then, was the variety Ingrid or was it a different variety maybe? That's what I'd love to know as well. If they can type again though, I was still answering the question, but I was
Well,
just going to, I was going to make one other point there, and that was it's a trade-off too, you see, because even though the peas are more likely to drag things down, the one good thing in an organic situation that the peas are doing, they're effectively like a free herbicide. I shouldn't use the word herbicide, but they're doing the role of controlling weeds. They're so competitive, how they cover the ground and how they knit together. And for a long time, they prevent weeds from coming back up through the crop. So you don't want to go too scarce in organic or you're losing that benefit. Um, yeah, no, I would say if you can use, as I say, the variety Ingrid, or I'm very interested to try that variety, Mantara, was it, Heath, the one you mentioned, the
yeah.
maple tea. So I might try and get some of that to trial this year.
And do you find
And
that high stand density helps, Martin?
I
Stand.
would say, yeah, if you look at Sheila's work on the Valpro path where she had solo crops of beans and solo crops of peas as well, I was watching very carefully what happened with the bean yield. So with the early ripening varieties of beans, which was Virey and Louis, particularly the Virey, the yield kept rising all the way up to 80 plants per square meter. And it was phenomenal. And now in the traditional bean, it kind of tapered off at about 60. But
Wow.
so it could be it's a different type of bean completely, and we need to look at it in more carefully to see how can we maximize its yield. Yeah.
okay, one final question because I'm just conscious of time here. Maybe Pete, start with you in this one. Have you seen problems from growing a legume year on year?
Well, we just don't do it. I think that there is evidence. What you find genetically, peas, beans, lentils, and grass pea. We don't grow so much grass pea anymore, but historically it was a crop. Are all genetically quite related. They're all nodulate with similar rhizobia, and I wouldn't mix up any of them in a rotation. So, but you know yourself, certainly we have a 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 rule, depending who you are. But I would say 1 in 6 is more common. You just won't crop peas or beans again. However, if you've got other pulses to choose from, like soybean is different enough, and there are some people growing soybean with a soybean crop at the Institute. If you can grow lupin, you can throw that in a bit more often. So I think we don't know enough about really the diseases and how transferable they are. There's an assumption that I know you can get common diseases of peas and beans, but that doesn't mean it's the same strains of fungi that are doing the job. So I just don't think there's enough research into what's going on. But I do have colleagues in France who grow very, very high densities of legumes, but they've got more legumes to choose from.
Okay. And do you want to add to that, Martin?
Yeah, no, I think we just have to be careful because sometimes you have to listen to the more conventional science. Sometimes there's lessons there to draw. Because you could go to the well someday and it's dry if you overdo it, and then we were wondering what happened.
There is a general
So
worry in the industry, I think, Martin, from cover crops, because a lot of the cover crops have got Vicia types in them.
yeah,
And we have another PhD just started looking at the pathology of that and whether even cover crops that contain P types can present a disease risk. So we're trying to dig into
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Okay, folks, I think we've ran out of time, and certainly between the two of you, you could keep the conversation going for quite some time. So thank you so much, Pete and Martin. I think plenty of food for thought, and I think we should have a part 2 on that. There's a lot more unknowns in the whole area, but thank you so much to you both for sharing your experiences. And just maybe to give a shout out that our next webinar is on the 1st of April, not a fool's day, I'm not joking, it is on Wednesday, the 1st of April at 7:30, and we're going to be looking at making quality silage. So until then, take care, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening. Bye-bye.